Hi, everybody, and welcome to another live chat with Polar Bears International and Explore.org. My name is Alysa McCall with Polar Bears International, and we are very excited to chat with you today about polar bears. Usually at this time of year, we are live from Buggy One on the shores of Hudson Bay near Churchill, Manitoba. But of course, as you know, this year looks a little bit different. So Buggy One, there it is in the picture there, is still out on the tundra, streaming you amazing polar bear footage every single day with our local staff members. But the rest of us are in our homes across North America and even up and coming to you with the power of technology. But it's been so great to use that technology to see what's going out on the tundra. It has been a fantastic week, great weekend, lots of incredible things happening on the 5 different polar bear cams spread out on the tundra near Churchill, Manitoba, and we'll talk about those cams in a minute. But first, I want to introduce to you the other folks joining us today and remind you to please ask any questions you have. Our theme today is around keeping polar bears and people safe in a changing climate. What does polar bear safety look like, especially in Churchill? We'll kind of focus on that, but we can answer any questions you have about polar bears, about Churchill, about the tech stuff going on. We want to know what you want to know. So we have your amazing Explore.org moderators that are sending us questions. So please type them in the chat box or on Facebook or however you'd like to ask questions. You can also email Polar Bears International at questions@polar.org, and we'll get back to you later on those absolutely as well. So joining us today is a very familiar face for you viewers, BJ Kirschhoffer, another PBI staff member. Hi, BJ. Little introduction.
Sure. Yeah. Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. Happy to be with you here from the office in Bozeman, Montana.
Yeah. And then also familiar face probably for many of you. And one of the reasons honestly ask any question today is that we're joined by Dr. Andy Deroche in Alberta. Hi, Andy. Can you introduce yourself and give the viewers a little blurb about you?
Yeah, sure. I'm Andy Deroche, professor of biological sciences at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. I've been studying polar bears in Canada and Norway and other parts of the Arctic for about 37 years now. So even Alysa was one of my students a long time ago. So it's an interesting business and it's an interesting profession, and polar bears are really cool. And if you've got some questions, we can certainly give it a whirl.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I realized this year it's 10 years since I first went to Churchill and saw polar bears. So marking a decade of knowing you and knowing the polar bears. And actually, that's when I met BJ too. So it's like the 10-year anniversary this month, which is kind of cool and kind of bittersweet to not be in Churchill for it. But it's, again, pretty fantastic that we can get together this way and still talk about polar bears. And I'm coming to you from my home in Whitehorse in the Yukon in Canada. So we are really spread out today, but very exciting to talk to you because I know the viewers are from all over the world. So anyone can talk about polar bears. Let's start with a little bit of Churchill context. So some folks know all of this in and out, but in case we have any other viewers, I'd love to build a little context of what people are seeing on the cams. So first, Andy, I'm going to ask you about why polar bears are near Churchill, and then BJ, I want to ask you a bit about the cam setup in Churchill. So Andy, could you tell our viewers a little bit about the polar bears near Churchill? Who are they and why are they there?
Yeah, for sure. I think the number one thing is that when we look at polar bears around the circumpolar Arctic, there's what I call 3 jewels in the polar bear crown. One of them is in Churchill, Manitoba. The other one is in Wrangel Island in Russia, and the other is up in Svalbard. And what's happening here is right in Wapusk National Park is sort of the core of the polar bear denning area. So all the bears that we're seeing on camera were probably born in that denning area. And what they do is they show a high degree of fidelity to coming back to that area when the sea ice melts during the summer. So what we have is an annual ice system in the Hudson Bay. So in the next month or so, we hope the ice will come back and the bears will then leave land and go out onto the sea ice to hunt seals. The only bears that will stay on land over winter are those pregnant females that will be in dens, and then they'll come out in February and March, head back out onto the sea ice with their cubs to feed. So all the bears that are on land, they're basically just on holidays right now. They're not feeding much. There's not a lot to eat out along the coast of Hudson Bay. Sometimes they'll find a dead seal or some berries or grass or kelp. There's not a lot. So they're basically losing body mass at this time of year. They're burning up somewhere around 2 pounds or 1 kilogram of body weight per day. They really want to get out onto the sea ice. And one of the ways they get out on the sea ice is they start migrating up the coast, because there's sort of an east-west part of the coast, right from Churchill out to Cape Churchill, and the ice gets caught there earlier. And we've also got the earliest forming of ice. So what we've got is a perfect platform for the bears to get out. And once they get on that ice, they take off as quickly as they can, heading out into the bay to start feeding on seals. So they want to get out as quickly as possible. And Churchill and Cape Churchill area is the best place to do that.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Andy. And it's also one of the best places to put cameras to watch what's happening out there. BJ, could you tell the viewers a little bit about the camera setup, Phil, that really you've done from the ground up? I mean, it's been amazing to see its evolution.
Yeah, so I think if you've tuned in to the cameras over the years, you'll probably have noticed there's an evolution there. We try to keep adding things to the Churchill area, but this year has been a great year. We've seen a lot there at Cape Churchill, off the Cape Churchill Tower, on Buggy One, and at the lodge. Now, like Andy describes there, one of the reasons for putting the cameras where we have is that the bears are in a predictable place. Other places in the Arctic, it's hard to catch up with a polar bear. They much prefer to be out on the sea ice, wandering around looking for seals, their favorite food. Of course, the bears, as Andy has described, are waiting for that sea ice to return, and so they're in a predictable spot. We know generally where they're going to be on the shores there, waiting for that ice to stack up between Churchill and Cape Churchill. Of course, we didn't come up with this. We're piggybacking on work that, of course, Alysa, Andy, and their predecessors had done. The tower itself was built by Ian Sterling to look at polar bears, and so this was a spot where bears could be seen for research, and now it's a spot, the same vantage point that the researchers had starting in the 70s. You can enjoy from the comfort of your home. There's the Cape Churchill Tower there. Andy can maybe describe what it's like to live in there. He has spent some time in there. I just get to go for quick visits to check up on things, but it is definitely a very unique spot to have a camera. It's also a very cold spot.
It's not comfortable to be in that tower. I spent a month up there. I think it was 1985, and it's kind of appropriate because what I was actually doing was testing deterrent plastic bullets. They were, at the time, the only sort of deterrent that we had for polar bears were these big rubber bullets that were basically riot control devices. They were huge, and they had been used with some extent or success with bears, but then one bear died when a game officer shot it. It broke some ribs, and everybody said, well, that's not a very good deterrent approach. So we were using these small plastic projectiles shot from a shotgun, and we would hit the bear in the rump and then try to assess if we could sort of deter them. And it actually was quite successful. And since that time, those sorts of little projectiles have developed, and now we have things that are like little bean bags that you can shoot from a shotgun, hit the bear, and scare them away. Because one of the things about bears in general, and polar bears in particular, is that they really do respond to these sort of physical deterrents. Yes, you can put out a banger or you can try to scare them, but they very quickly learn that nothing bad happens. So there's a loud noise, but bears are really smart and they quickly figure out that nothing bad happens, so I can keep on coming. Whereas, of course, if they get hit with these physical devices, then it works quite well as a deterrent, because that's sort of working within the context of how bears work. If you're around another bear and it gives you a big punch, yeah, you'll probably leave pretty quick. So it's the same sort of approach that we take, and it's a lot better option than some of the other alternatives for dealing with problem bears.
I think that's such a good to make. People often ask how to stay safe from polar bears, and that the physical stuff is very important. And that's one reason that Polar Bears International staff, we always carry bear spray in the field. And there's been, we do hear often people thinking bear spray can't be that effective. There's no way. What if the Arctic's windy or cold? It's not going to work. But recent research that we were involved in came out and showed that bear spray is quite effective against polar bears, even when it's cold outside and windy. And it's absolutely a good deterrent and definitely better than nothing. So we always on our person. And BJ has some personal experience with that out at the Cape Tower, actually. BJ, could you tell your story?
Sure. So Jeff York, another staff member, and I were out there doing some work. Of course, we were not on the ground. We were on Buggy One itself. This was a time of year when we could get Buggy One out there to do some annual maintenance on the tower itself, as well as the cameras, to make sure that they're functioning for the viewers to be able to see what's going on out there. And we had a bear that behaved pretty strangely. There was some other animals in the area, other polar bears in the area, and typically when you make a loud noise, usually around polar bears, they at least have a look. Maybe they run away and then look. But this bear, when it heard the loud noise, it actually came running full tilt towards the noise, which was pretty strange to see, in my opinion. So I was climbing the tower itself, uh, leaving the buggy as a platform, nice and safe, getting up higher to do some work, and made a loud clang because that tower is quite loud. And man, this bear just came in hot, and it stayed with us for the next 2 days, systematically dismantling Buggy One. It was biting on the metal, it was pushing on the sides. It wanted in, and so finally, after a couple days of this, we decided that probably if this bear got close to other humans that weren't as fortunate to be in the tundra buggy, things probably wouldn't be so good for either animal. So we thought maybe we would move it away, and so we tried bear spray on it, and it was quite effective. It was maybe 2 or 3 seconds of spraying the spray, and that thing just took off running. It ran for the hills. So it's a very effective tool.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. If it had come into contact with people in the future like that, there's a good chance a bear that aggressive could have been destroyed. But instead, now it's learned that a couple seconds of discomfort with the bear spray, not worth it, going to take off. Everyone's alive and safe at the end of the day. Andy, do you have any experience with bears that are a little aggressive than the average polar bear, or using bear spray or anything like that?
It's yeah, one of the things is bears are individuals, and
Yeah.
they vary in their behavior a lot. And so it's interesting as you talk about this bear coming around the tower. When we were out at the Cape, there were 30 or 40 big males all around the area, and some younger bears coming through. And I remember there was this one big bear that just took a real interest in the tower. And the reason we knew it was the same bear is he had this perfect scar that went right up above his eye, and it came right through his eye and down below. So he looked kind of like a pirate or something. And anyways, he would come and every day would stand up at the corner of the tower and just pound on it for 5, 10 minutes. And then it's almost like I felt like I was in a cartoon, and it was like Tweety Bird was going to fall out of the nest if he just shook it hard enough. And every day he came back and did the same thing. And I guess, I don't know what he really thought he was going to get from this, if there was some idea that there was food to be gained. But bears are individuals. And we see this when we're catching bears, we keep notes on their behavior about how they're responding. And some bears are incredibly aggressive and some are very passive. And I've seen this time and time again. And the big peril when you're out in polar bear country is you don't actually know which of those bears you're going to be meeting at any given moment. Is it going to be one that's going to run away, or is it going to be the one that runs towards you? And that's why that bear spray is a really good thing to have with you as a first line of defense. Um, the very first time I ever was introduced to the bear spray was in the 1980s, and somebody was so keen to show me how it worked. Is that we were at what was called the Churchill Northern Study Center, and we stepped outside, And I don't think the guy really knew that much about what he was doing, because of course he let out this big blast of it right into the wind. And of course, we were crying and coughing and sneezing, and I mean, it's pretty nasty stuff. And it was pretty painful, but it gave me a pretty good indication that, yeah, if a bear got a snootful of that, it would probably not be that happy. And it is shown to actually be more effective than using firearms, mainly because most people aren't trained in using firearms around a bear that's maybe coming in at 20 miles per hour or 30 kilometers per hour running straight in at you. So it's most people aren't ready to use firearms in that context. You're not trained for it, so it's surprising how fast polar bears can be, and that's why bear spray is really good. It's a close, as you saw with that video, it's a very close sort of thing. So you have to have nerves of steel, because if you start letting it go too early, it doesn't actually work. You have to really catch the bear just at that sort of near in distance. So it's effective.
That's good. And generally, yeah, more user friendly than maybe firearms for many people. Things, if people would be concerned about a bit of blowback in the wind, I'd say it's maybe a bit better to get a whiff of bear spray than get too close to a bear potentially. So,
Well,
have less
you
pain
know
with the
the old
bear
joke.
spray.
You know the old joke, right? If the bear spray doesn't work on you and you get it in your face, at least you won't see what's going to happen if the bear attacks.
There you go. See what you can get.
That's
Andy's
not a
got the
nice
best
story.
tricks.
Yeah, but at least you won't
But
know
it
what's
is.
going
But
to
this is
happen.
good. Yeah, the bear
Yeah.
attacks are a real thing, and they're a rising problem. And yeah, a bit of humor definitely helps. But we do want to reiterate to people that bear spray is a good tool to have if you are in bear country, especially polar bear country, and learning how to use it effectively and store it safely and handle it safely really could save a life. So please do look into bear spray, and we can post more information or keep talking about it as well. I'd like to shift gears just a little, but we've been talking about the Cape Tower, and Andy spoke about how they at the Cape Tower used to test this one type of deterrent. And BJ had mentioned how it's such a great place to do things for polar bears because it's so predictable that polar bears will be there. And that's one reason that one of PBI's projects, the Spotter RF project, or the Polar Bear Radar, has been situated out at the Cape Tower. And it also has a pretty interesting safety angle. BJ, could you talk a little bit about that project that's going on?
Sure, be happy to. So we're using something called compact surveillance radar. It's made by a company called Spotter RF. And this tool was designed to see movement out in the field beyond. So maybe for military purposes, so that so you can see what's coming towards you. It's also been used at airports and power substations, things like that, where you want to know what's happening over a large area when it comes to things that are moving, like people or vehicles or animals. And so we thought this might be a really neat tool, potentially for communities in the north, because, in the far north, the weather can be quite poor. It can be blowing snow where it obstructs your view. It can also be very dark half the year. The Arctic is plunged into darkness. Depending on your latitude, you could have very little daylight to no daylight. And so making kind of early detection of polar bears coming into a community quite difficult. So this tool can see in the dark. It can see through blowing snow. Again, it's looking for movement. What we're doing with it, and what you're looking at right now, is a clip of the polar bear radar, if you will, moving a camera to focus in on this bear that's moving around out there. So, a couple of things on how it works. The bear doesn't have to be tagged, so we can probably talk about that a little bit later. But there's all the thing is doing is looking for objects that move out there. And part of what we're doing at Cape Churchill then is trying to use some artificial intelligence to figure out what polar bears look like to radar. The radar itself has this AI function built in, and we're currently training it. So if we see a caribou, we can label it as a caribou. If we see a polar bear, we can label it as a polar bear. And after we get enough polar bears within the system there, it can start saying with a degree of certainty, maybe 50%, 60%, whatever, that, hey, I think this is a polar bear. You should pay attention to this. What's also neat about the tool is it has a lot of kind of programmability, if you will, built in. So what we can do is say, well, if the AI, if the artificial intelligence thinks that it's a polar bear, then maybe it blinks a light, or maybe it sends a text message, or maybe it sends an email. If it's a caribou, well, we'll watch it, but we don't need to set the alarms off, sort of thing. So there's all these different kind of programmable functions that we can do and test to see, what would be maybe most effective for northern communities in communicating that something is, in fact, moving out there.
BJ, do you think the radar picked up that wolverine over the weekend that was on the cams?
I was out of the office, so I didn't see if it grabbed the wolverine or not. And we focused our recording efforts over to the lodge cam. So I didn't see if I pick it up. But honestly, it can see even the smallest things. It did grab one of the hares running around out there, one of the Arctic hares. Picked that up, although those are kind of big if you think about it. That is a pretty big target. It has picked up snow buntings, which are small birds, in the past. So it is a pretty sensitive target. I think the key is, how do you turn that sensitivity down? Because even bushes blowing within range can set it off. So how do you filter movement you're not interested in versus the things that we are, which are the polar bears?
That's a very interesting problem to work on solving with this type of technology. Very, very cool. And so was the wolverine. So if anyone over the weekend, I'm sure you can go back and look at the clips that were taken. It was a very cool last few days on the cams, including the mother with triplet cubs, which was pretty special to see. So some of you got some great screenshots of that. Really nice to see. Hopefully we see that family group again. I just want to pop over to a couple questions quick, and then I want to revisit the kind of community safety angle. But we have a question from Bearberry that came in. I'm going to throw this to Andy. Andy, how is the sea ice situation in the area this year?
So, well, it's interesting because 2020 was our second worst year on record for sea ice. Only 2012 was worse than what we saw across the Arctic this year. And it's interesting because when we talk about sea ice and polar bears, there's no one size that fits all. And so we've got 19 populations around the circumpolar Arctic, and each one of them experiences a different year depending on what happens to the ice. So globally, the ice was really bad. But in some parts of the Arctic, so off of the Canadian coast in Northwest Territories, the Yukon and Alaska, there was a fair bit of ice not that far offshore. And while we don't know for sure, we suspect that the bears there were doing quite well. Bears in the Svalbard area and further into the Russian Arctic, particularly in the central Siberian Arctic, had by far the worst ice conditions that they have ever seen. And in reality, broke all sorts of records and are still breaking records for lack of sea ice. So on this global map, right where it says Russia there, there's nothing there for sea ice. We don't know very much about the bears in that area, but we would predict that those bears are having a very, very bad year. So again, 19 different scenarios are playing out. Svalbard in Norway, I worked there for a number of years, is not doing very well for ice. Churchill, Manitoba, and the whole Hudson Bay ecosystem. I was checking the Canadian Ice Service today. There's still virtually no ice. Just around a couple of the communities, they're starting to get a little bit of ice forming, but we're not seeing much happening. The ice is coming back. It always does. It's getting dark and cold in the Arctic. But it's definitely not looking like an early freeze up for 2020. And of course, if we're looking now, we're almost at Halloween in Churchill. There were years when we've already had sea ice at this time of year, but right now it looks like we're not on track for an early freeze up, so the bears won't be disappearing. But it's kind of an interesting year in Hudson Bay. We're not out there doing research, but the bears that we were tracking by satellite telemetry actually managed to stay out on the ice quite late this year. So it was a fairly good year for the bears. And I suspect that might be why we're seeing a female with a set of triplets. Is 2019 was not as bad as some years, and 2020 was pretty good. And in order to raise triplets in that population, you really need a couple of good years to really carry off a litter of cubs. The added cub is a lot of extra nutritional stress on the mother. So it's unfortunate we're not out there to get the data this year to see how they're doing, but we suspect they might be doing okay. Although I've seen a few pictures of some pretty skinny bears on some of the webcam images this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely been a mix of healthy looking and skinny bears. That's really interesting breakdown of what the CACE is doing right now. Thank you for that, Andy. You mentioned satellite collared bears and that we weren't able to do the research this year to put new ones out. We have a question from Amanda and Amelia. What time of year do you catch polar bears, and do you do it while they're waiting for the ice in Churchill?
Yeah, we can. There's basically two periods that it's safe to catch the bears. It's either when they're on land, usually in beginning of September, once the temperatures start to cool down a bit. Bears are prone to overheat if you chase them by a helicopter, so you want to do it when it's cool out. So we do some on land sampling at that time of the year because all the population is on land in Hudson Bay. Most other populations, though, are actually sampled in the springtime when the bears are out on the sea ice. And we find them by following their footprints in the snow. And then we can catch them at that time of year. The temperatures are cool. We have nice, stable sea ice that we can work on, land on. And so those are the two periods. So it's sort of a fall and spring type of program. We can't do any work in most areas in the middle of winter because you have to remember above the Arctic Circle, there is no daylight for an extended period for weeks or months. And so at those sorts of constraints, that's really where we can get them. If you wait too late into the spring, then we start to get the ice breakup. There's too much open water, which makes it dangerous for the bears and bear researchers. So it's this two sort of windows of time that we have to work on the bears.
And even though satellite collars aren't going out this fall and that one fall session was canceled this year, there's still some chance that we get some GPS ear tags out this fall through Manitoba Sustainable Development and the Polar Bear Alert Team. Would you be able to tell people a little bit about that program that's happening?
Yeah, so we've been trying to find out about sort of the movement ecology and the timing of when the bears move off of the sea ice. And so for adult female bears, they can wear a satellite collar around their neck and it's not a problem for them at all. But for young bears that are growing or for big adult males, we can't put a collar around their necks. It's too dangerous to put a collar around a growing bear. And for big males, they'll just rip them off. They're so strong, they just will tear them apart. So what we look at is an alternate, and in recent years, the company out of Arizona called Telonix has made this very small, very lightweight radio tag, and it gives us not as much information for not as long, but we get one location a day from these bears, and they can last. We've had some last up to 6 months. The telemetry collars, though, give us 6 locations per day, and they last for up to 2 years. Usually we just have an automatic release mechanism on the collars. So that's the problem. If we had known that we were in a pandemic, we probably would have left our collars on for another year. But they have a small programmable device that just goes on the collar. And then on a given date, usually about September 1st, they just open up and then they fall off the bear. We pick them up, send them away, get new batteries put in them, and then we can use them again. Unfortunately, if we'd have known, we would have kept all our collars on for another year so we could track them. But as it stands right now, we've lost that source of insight. But hopefully, with the Polar Bear Alert program, out of the government of Manitoba, they will be deploying some ear tag radios on bears that they handle as part of their control action. For bears that do come around town, they'll catch them, they hold them in the polar bear holding facility, and when they let them go, they'll put on one of these tags. So we'll get some insights on where the bears are at this year.
And that also has a bit of a community safety angle, those tags, don't they? Especially at this time of year, and especially if the sea ice is late in forming.
Well, it is. It's been quite interesting because one of the questions that the wildlife officers had and the biologists in Manitoba is, well, if we catch these bears and we move them outside of town, and in particular, they're usually moved north by helicopter, the question is, will they come back? And so the nice thing is that the wildlife officers can watch the bears and say, okay, this bear is coming back. We should go try to haze it away, get the helicopter over there to push it farther back away. Or if it comes right into town, they can catch it again. One of the other questions that we're addressing is that there was concern from the community north of Churchill in Arviat that bears that were being handled in Manitoba and then released just north of town were subsequently becoming problem bears in their community. And so one of the things we were trying to find out is how many of these bears actually do go into communities after they've been a problem bear in Churchill. Right now, we're still looking at that data, but preliminary analyses suggest that most of the bears that have been handled in Churchill, once they're let go, they seem reluctant to get involved with people again. But there are lots of attractants in the communities, and the community of Arviat has an open dump that they try to keep bears out of, but it's not very effective. So there's a lot of attractants that bring a hungry bear in. So the best thing for the bears and human bear interactions is to have sea ice form earlier. Just means the bears can get back out onto the sea ice, which is where they really want to be and where they want to be hunting at this time of year if they can.
Absolutely. Yeah, these communities across the north that really deal with polar bears in and around them, especially at this time of year and in the spring, they have a lot on their plates. And we've talked about a few different tools that can be used that can help either warn people or protect them. But every community is going to have a different situation, and it's going to depend on the year. I wanted to just briefly tell you about one little tool that Polar Bears International helped work on because it's fun. We worked on a coloring book for kids, and it's all about polar bear safety, and I believe you can actually find the download on our website, or at least a few pages. So we got input from multiple communities, and especially Churchill. How do you talk to your children about being safe around polar bears? Most of us don't need to worry about. Kids can go to the park and walk to their friend's house and hang out and go build a snow castle. It's not a big deal, but for some, there's a predator out there potentially. So this book is a lighthearted way to just let kids know how to stay safe, play only when it's light outside, when there's an adult nearby, don't walk down alleyways, look before you go outside, just kind of these practical things with a bit of fun polar bear knowledge and information and lots of cool things to color. So we just like to point out that kind of more lighthearted tool as well. So we're gonna just change gears for 2 seconds. We have more questions rolling in now, which is great. And that's really the ultimate point of these chats, is to take your questions. So I'm gonna get to a couple questions here. Andy, this one's for you. This one's always a fun one. This is from Tallulah. Could you share some information about polar bears and grizzly or brown bears meeting and mating? Is it possible genetically, and have there been offspring from that? And do they survive? Just tell us all about the growler bear, please.
Yeah, growler bears, or pisleys as some people call them. I mean, scientifically, we don't make up names for hybrids, but yes, we have had hybrids. The only ones that we know about in sort of the more recent times were in the Canadian Arctic, in the sort of the northwest part of an area known as the Beaufort Sea, on two islands, Victoria Island and Banks Island. And it looks like what happened is grizzly bears moved from the mainland of Canada across the water there between the two big islands. So right where it says Canada on that map, just north of there, there's a gap between the two islands that are sort of up that way. One is Banks Island, the furthest west, and then Victoria. And we think that grizzly bears crossed over from the mainland across what's called Dolphin Union Strait and settled on Victoria Island. And we were starting to get reports of grizzly bears being there all the time and hibernating over winter there. And then eventually some of those bears dispersed even further north. And what it looks like what happened is almost all the hybrids that we know about seem to come from one female polar bear that mated with two different male grizzly bears. And she gave birth to some cubs, and of course, then they dispersed out. And then interestingly, some of those cubs subsequently mated with other grizzly bears. So we end up with hybrids that are half polar bear, half grizzly bear. And then we got some second generation that are now 3/4 grizzly bear and 1/4 polar bear. So one of the things is, of course, these are viable hybrids, meaning that they can give birth to young themselves and they can cross with either of the parent species. So it indicates the very close evolutionary history between grizzly bears and polar bears. And if we go back in time, like 100,000 years, we know that these species hybridized as well during other cold periods. And we have very strong evidence of hybrids that occurred in Ireland. So during an ice age, 100,000 years ago, the ice came further south, and with it, the polar bears came. And there were brown bears in Ireland at the time, and they managed to breed with polar bears. And of course, when the climate warmed up, the polar bears disappeared, went further north. Of course, grizzly bears are no longer found in Ireland. They went extinct, hunted to extinction. And what we ended up with was some genetic signature in polar bears from those hybridizations. We also know that there was another hybrid event. Now that looks to me like that's a black bear. Somebody's trying to pull a fast one on us. I don't think that's a grizzly. I'm not too sure, but it's always hard to tell. But I'd be looking for the hump on the back if it was a grizzly. Anyways, we had another hybridization event in the Alaskan islands. And in that event, again, a cold period, polar bears came south and were living in that area. But then when it warmed up, the grizzly bears moved back in. And they basically swamped the genetics of the polar bears that were in the area. Most of the bears probably left with the sea ice, but those that remained, the only way we can see it is that some of the grizzly bears living in these islands actually have a few polar bear genes left in them. Of course, they just look like grizzly bears now, but we can see genetically that they've got these markers in them that came from that historical event or prehistorical event.
Fascinating. I think everyone's interested in that topic. It's just such a one to hear about. Thank you for explaining that, Andy. I just want to give a quick shout out to Katie Miller, who's behind the scenes, one of Polar Bears International staff members, who's kind of next to the office, next to BJ, I believe, and she's doing all this mixing right now. So everything you're seeing is thanks to Katie. So she and BJ make a great tech team down and pulling in all these different streams. So thank you making this happen. It's very cool. On the fly. Okay, we've got one quick question from Carol Bear. Andy, how long do cubs stay with their moms?
Well, a lucky cub gets to stay with its mom for 2.5 years. But you have to think that most cubs actually don't live that long. So they're actually with their mothers until 2.5 years. They're nursing right up until they leave their mother pretty much. Which can be really strange because you can see a 2.5-year-old male cub can actually be bigger than its mother, and yet it's still nursing. So it's quite an unusual sight. They're not getting very much nutrition once they're past their first year, but it maintains the social bond between the mother and the offspring. And then the other thing it does is it keeps her from cycling back into breeding condition. So, but it's also important to think that most cubs actually don't make it to 2.5 years. The survival rate to that age of weaning, when they leave their mother, Varies a lot. Some years it can be quite high if the conditions are good, the mother's in good condition, and the hunting's really good. But on average, probably less than half of the cubs that are born actually make it to their second birthday. And then even when they leave their mother, um, they're large bears, but they're still really inexperienced hunters. And being a subadult bear is not an easy thing to be. They're not as big. They lose a lot of the kills that they make to other bears. A bigger bear comes in and takes their lunch away. It's not much fun. It's tough being a baby polar bear, but 2.5 years is enough time for them to learn where to hunt, how to hunt, the navigation patterns. Where should I go in summer to find a place to live? So that's the standard. It's interesting though. If we went back when I first started studying polar bears in the 1980s, we actually had polar bear cubs being weaned from their mother at 1.5 years of age, and they were actually surviving. But that was when the ecological conditions in Hudson Bay were extremely good, and the bears could sort of adapt to keeping their cubs for only 1.5 years. So it was meaning that quite a different ecological setup at the time. The population was much more productive and growing quite quickly at that time.
That's an interesting tidbit. Thank you for that explanation. Couple more questions and we're going to start wrapping up here. We've got a question about how one gets involved with polar research via citizen science. For that, I want to direct you to the Beluga Boat Citizen Science Project. So that's also via explore.org and something that Polar Bears International is involved with. Maybe one of our incredible mods can post a link in there. If you are interested in watching back old footage of the beluga whales in the Churchill River, you can actually help scientists figure out the demographics of the whales, social structure in the pods. There's some really, really cool citizen science research happening via these org camps in Churchill. So check that out. This is an interesting question from Jinray. And I don't know if there's really an answer, but maybe there is, Andy. On average, how many times will you have to move a polar bear before they don't return? And I believe that this is in relation to the Polar Bear Alert Team moving the bears away or out of town. And it probably depends on the bear, I would think.
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of really bad actors in the population. Some bears just don't seem to learn, and part of it deals with what sort of experience they have when they get into town. And if they get food, a food reward, like they get into somebody's dog food, or perhaps somebody's got a dead seal that they've harvested, if a bear gets that food reward, they keep coming back. Years and years ago, somebody decided that they wanted to raise pigs in the town of Churchill. And of course, that sounded like a good idea if you wanted some bacon. But of course, polar bears were happy to share in the pigs as well. And anyways, the bears broke into the pig pen, ate the pigs, and for years after, those bears came back time and time again. And now in Churchill, if a bear has a really bad record of coming around all the time, like it's handled this year and next year and the year after, it's a higher likelihood candidate to be kept in the polar bear jail or the holding facility until the sea ice comes back, and then they just release the bear out onto the sea ice. But in reality, some bears never come into Churchill. They're not attracted in, they're very wary, and yet other bears are much more prone to come in. There's a bit of a pattern where subadult males are the most likely bears to come into town. But once they grow up a bit and become good, effective hunters and they're not hungry in the fall, they just stay away from town. And so we can see a bear that might have been caught in Churchill 5, 6 times when they were younger. But as they age, we just see them out on the coast of Hudson Bay and they just chill for the summer, wait for the sea ice to come back, and then they take off. So there's a lot of variation between individuals, but there's no sort of, everybody's got their own history and their own trajectory as to what they're going to do. Some bears are very, very scared of humans. They see one and they run. And Other bears, they see a human and come to check it out to see what's going on. So there's a lot of variation.
Mhm. Even though there is so much individual variation in this population and all the populations, as we see sea ice continue to decline and bears get further and further nutritionally stressed, we do believe and foresee that polar bear human conflict will be on the rise, which is part of why we are talking about polar bear safety. And we've talked a little bit about some of the tools available and some that are being on for folks, but we feel like it's very important that ultimately climate change is the number one issue facing polar bears, and that's what we all need to tackle is the melting of sea ice due to increased fossil fuel emissions, trapping too much heat in our atmosphere. But as we tackle this big problem that's facing all polar bears, in the meantime, it's important that we keep as many polar bears in the population as we can, and that means lowering the number of defense kills, keeping polar bears and people separate wherever we can, keeping them safe. Andy, I was hoping you could just help us wrap up a little bit by kind of telling people what we can expect, especially in the Hudson Bay region, as we continue to see these sea ice losses and what that means for polar bears staying on land longer and longer, and the people that share this land with them.
Yeah, well, for just a brief sort of bit of perspective for around Churchill,
Mhm.
in the 80s and early 90s, we had about 1,200 bears that lived in around Churchill. It's now about 800, and we think it's probably fairly stable at about that number right now. It might have dropped a little bit lower, but again, 2020 might actually be adding more cubs to the population, but we'll find out next year. But the big concern in this part of the Arctic is climate change, as you've outlined, and it's just a habitat loss issue. The bears are incredibly well adapted to going long periods of time without food. They can easily go for many months without eating, but that is only possible if they come ashore in basically good body condition, if they're fat enough. And so bears are using up this energy as they're on land. And if it gets too long without sea ice, then we start to see bears dying of starvation. But what's too long? Well, right now we're seeing some years where we have about 165 or so days without sea ice. We're pretty sure from our analyses that once we cross 180 days, things start to go bad quite quickly for some bears in the population. Not all, because there's always going to be some fat bears and some skinnier bears. Once we get out to 200 days of ice-free conditions, it's quite unlikely that the population of bears in that area will persist in any significant numbers. There might be a few bears that can hang on. Once we get along past 210 days, it's unlikely that there would be any bears in Churchill left. So the big question is, when could we get to that sort of level of ice-free days? And it really depends on what people decide to do about climate change and global warming. And are we willing as a society and as humanity as a whole to reduce our power consumption through fossil fuels so that we can get back in balance with the planet and allow the Arctic to cool over time? But it's going to take hundreds or thousands of years for that cooling to occur. And right now, we're still in a warming trajectory in the Arctic. So it's a tenuous future for polar bears in some parts of their distribution. Our best analyses are that we'll still have polar bears in the very high Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic, and in Greenland out to the end of this century. But beyond that, it really just depends on what we do today to deal with climate change so that future generations hopefully have polar bears in the wild. And as we start to come in balance, that the Arctic will cool again if we can get carbon dioxide levels down and methane levels down. And if it does, then polar bears could recolonize the areas where they once lived. That's the hope, anyways.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's no tipping point for sea ice of which there's no return. We know that once we start getting these emissions under control, sea ice eventually will rebound. And our polar bears is very much shared, and whatever we do for them is good for ourselves too. And we really do need some systemic change and some big thinking and working together as communities to affect this change. And we know we can do it. The tools are there. Solar's never been cheaper. There's more wind power than ever. We have these opportunities. We need to leverage our voices and push our leaders to make these changes for ourselves and for polar bears. And with that, we are going to wrap up. So there have been a few unanswered questions. We'll hop into the comments and try to get them answered for you. If not now, then definitely next live chat. The next live chat is tomorrow, so don't miss it if you can. It's at 1 p.m. Central with the very fantastic Mike Fitz. Ranger Mike will be chatting with PBI's Jeff York, and there'll be, oh no, it's BJ. Is it BJ? Are you Mike tomorrow?
It's me.
It's BJ. Jeff had to do something else with media. I just remembered. There you go. Well, that's going to be a fantastic talk. So the theme is feast and fasting, brown bears, and how the brown bear cans are different than the polar bear cans. I think it'll be a super fun chat with Mike and BJ. So we look forward to that. And of course, this weekend is Halloween in Churchill, which means extra bear safety. Usually we'd be there, and there's always this annual giant party in Churchill, but this year's looking a little different, of course. There might still be a bit of treating, so I'm sure folks will still be out making sure the kids are safe no matter what they're doing. And you'll probably see a little bit more about Halloween there too. Polar Bear Week is also next week, so please do check out what we're planning for Polar Bear Week. There will be at least one live chat, I believe, on Thursday, but there will be other events too. I think you can look forward to a meditation hour on Tuesday, zen out with some polar bears with some lovely music, maybe a bit of poetry. I'm going to try to have a really fun week all about polar bears, lots of ways you can get involved and learn more about us, and all sorts of ways to ask questions as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up. I want to thank BJ so much for joining today. I think it was a really great chat, fantastic facts and anecdotes and jokes, and it's always fun chatting with you guys no matter where we are, even though we can't be hanging out on Buggy One together. It's nice to hang out this way virtually. Do you guys want to say anything, say goodbye to folks, or wrap up?
Just want to say thanks, Alysa and Andy. It's a pleasure being on the line with you here today, and look forward to seeing all of you viewers on the cams here through the rest of the season. Polar bear season's just getting started.
Not much else from here. Polar bear tip, safety tip. If you live in the Arctic, don't dress up as a polar bear for Halloween, kids.
That's a good one.
Andy. Yeah, that's actually a very good one. Yeah, as you get told that in Churchill, and that's a solid tip. And please, viewers, keep posting the snapshots that you're getting on the cams. We love seeing them. Sometimes we miss what's happening on the cams while we're working on other stuff, and we'll go back and see what you guys are watching and text each other, be like, oh my gosh, this was just on the cam. Someone got a video of it or whatever. So we love it. Thank you so much for being involved. Thank you for your questions. And we will see you very soon out on the tundra. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. We hope you leave here feeling inspired and return home to leverage your voice and your influence, because together we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.